Chairman at Max Financial Services Limited, and Naoyuki Yoshino, who is a Dean at Asian Development Bank Institute. Over to you, Dr. Malhotra.
Thank you so much, and welcome to session 3. Our debate will focus on the most topical issue, climate financing for sustainable growth. As you all know, recent decades have seen growing appreciation of the need to transcend beyond national priorities and pursue long-term interests of our planet as a whole and its diverse life forms. There is a yearning, especially amongst the younger generations, for healthier, more sustainable lifestyles. There's also recognition that our societies have to put greater emphasis on reducing inequalities, advancing the dignity of the individual, and maintaining harmony between human beings and nature while addressing developmental, environmental, and ethical concerns. Indeed, climate change poses a global challenge whose consequences respect no boundary and are one with serious long-term sustainable development implications. It will intensify developmental challenges, and its harmful impact will be felt especially strongly by the poor and those who are vulnerable, and they will be particularly severely hit. In this context, the year 2015 had 3 important developments pertaining to sustainable development and climate financing, which are critical. I'll give them as a bit of background and then open the floor for our speakers. In July 2015, you had the 3rd International Financing for Development Conference, which adopted the Addis Ababa Accord that called for all financing to be climate-proofed, implying that renewable energy, low-carbon options, and environmentally sound development solutions be prioritized. But though developed countries theoretically recommitted to that long-pending ODA target under the Accord, which has never been anywhere near being achieved, the Accord itself did not come out with specific commitments on climate change, on climate finance. In September 2015, world leaders endorsed the Agenda 2030 at the UN New York conference, a new agenda for sustainable development for the next 15 years. And again, this is not a legally binding document, but it has unanimously agreed goals, unlike the Millennium Development Goals, which were really forced on member states by the UN Secretariat in one sense, even though they were endorsed by leaders. These are negotiated goals. You have 17 SDGs and 169 targets. And I believe they correctly assign priority to eradicating extreme poverty, followed by ending hunger, achieving improved nutrition, and promoting sustainable agriculture. But most importantly for this meeting, SDG 17 envisages a global partnership to meet the other 16 goals and enabling developing countries to more effectively access development and climate finance and environmentally sound technologies, besides boosting capacity development. Finally, in December of the same year, you had COP21, which adopted the Paris Agreement. I would only like to point out that while the Paris Agreement is contoured like a legally binding instrument, many of its important provisions are actually voluntary and non-binding. It substitutes the top-down approach of the Kyoto Protocol by a bottoms-up one based on voluntary, nationally determined pledges by each state party, known as the INDCs, now the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, like each country comes and says what it is going to put as a daan or a contribution, and that is how you proceed from the bottom up. By an inbuilt process, states parties will take stock of the collective progress every 5 years and put forward increasingly more ambitious NDCs. This is inbuilt into the agreement, and so the GHG emission reduction plans for every subsequent 5-year period are meant to be at a higher level than in the past. This is for states parties. It uses a transparency and accountability framework to incentivize all states parties to deliver on their non-legally binding NDCs or face public criticism and peer pressure. So that is the way the new agreement hopes to achieve the sort of solutions that it envisages. As per Climate Action Tracker, if you add up all the indices and the pledges made by various countries in connection with COP21, you will find that if all of them are fully implemented, you will at best limit temperature increases to 2.7 degrees centigrade. That's more than 0.7 degrees than what is hoped for. I mean, forget about the 1.5 degrees that is dreamt about. So financing is one of the key challenges for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Current funding levels are clearly insufficient to meet financial needs. I would say it is even worrisome that the contributions to the Green Climate Fund that was set up in 2009 as a key institution for global climate finance with a target of $100 billion annually by the year 2020 have barely crossed $10 billion, and now with the statement made by President Trump repudiating the Paris Agreement a few days ago, not even that amount, because they had promised $3 billion, of which evidently $1 billion has been given, I'm told. But now you can forget about the other two. So unless the climate finance scenario radically improves and enhanced financial and technological cooperation becomes available, the prospects of our effectively tackling climate change at the global level will be bleak. So our session will explore various financial options and discuss how the G20 platform under the German presidency can or has addressed the challenges faced in implementing climate financing. Finally, I want to say that transformation to a sustainable future cannot be achieved only through government efforts. It will require an inclusive pathway leading to change and involving action by government, by business and industry, by civil society, by NGOs, by the public at large. And the challenge, therefore, is to see that we create the conditions that involve and draw in all the stakeholders. I think adoption of internal carbon pricing is one thing that can be thought of by companies and industries. Issues of green bonds, issues of municipal bonds. These are all examples that we need to look at, and I do hope that the speakers on our panel will bring them up. And as I said, the entire issue has acquired great salience as a result of President Trump's repudiation of the agreement a few days ago. This does not kick in at once because you have 3 years to go, plus 1 year, 3 years before it becomes effective, and 1 year's notice. So you have 4 years to go from 4th November 2017, that means 4th November 2021. With these introductory remarks, I will request each of our 3 distinguished panelists to make a 20-minute presentation on the topic, as seen from her or his vantage position. And we'll follow that up by a discussion of about 20 minutes involving questions and answers from our audience addressed to the speakers. My first speaker will be Amar Bhattacharya. He's Senior Fellow at the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings Institution. He was from 2007 to 2014 Director of the G24, which, if you're not familiar, is the intergovernmental chapter of the G77 that coordinates the position of developing countries on international monetary and development finance issues to see that their interests are properly represented in negotiations on international financial matters. In that context, he has led the work program of the G24. He has been for some of the meetings involving the G20, and since he served as a principal point of interface between the G24 and the G20 at the working level. He's had a long career with the World Bank, his last position being senior advisor and head of its international policy and partnership group. With these introductory words, I give you the floor, so you have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Malhotra. It's great pleasure to be back for this ICRIER conference. It's always a way to connect the G20 with my roots. So it's nice, and it's particularly nice to be here in ICRIER. What I thought I would do is start a little bit with what does the withdrawal of the US imply for the pursuit of the Paris Agreement. Then I want to turn a little bit to the framework of climate finance. I want to spend some time on linking climate finance to sustainable infrastructure, which is perhaps the most important pathway to Paris. And then I want to end a little bit about what does this imply, at least from my perspective, for the aspirations for the Hamburg summit. In that, I will weave in the story of India, and I know that Nena will talk much more about that from the practical point of view. So I think the first thing I want to say is that as Ambassador Malhotra pointed out, 2015, 2016 were breakthrough years in terms of international cooperation. We talked till this morning about the challenges of cooperation in the G20 framework, but 2015 was really a milestone year through the adoption of the 2030 Development Agenda and the adoption of Paris. In that context also, it's very important to keep in mind that Paris was very, very different than the predecessor agreement or arrangement or the non-arrangement that existed before under the Kyoto Protocol in a number of respects. First, it was intentionally a non-binding agreement. And ironically, the reason it was a non-binding agreement was to make sure that the US would be in its fold. So that's why it was made into a non-binding agreement. Second, it recognized that ultimately, there were limitations of the previous arrangement, and in particular, the division between what we call Annex 1 or Annex 2, or developed and developing countries, was not a good frame for thinking about climate action. And Paris, therefore, recognizes very much the differentiation in responsibilities and in abilities, but it made it a universal commitment in the sense that everybody had to act in terms of the climate action, and the frame for doing that were the intended nationally defined contribution, meaning each country set out its plans. There was going to be verification, and very importantly, as Ambassador Malhotra pointed out, there was an understanding of ramping up actions over time because it was recognized that the initial commitments were not going to be sufficient. So the DNA of the Paris Agreement was very much this idea about voluntary commitments, but with peer pressure and with ramping up actions as the spirit. Now, the US has withdrawn, it says, from it. In effect, even before it withdrew from the agreement, or its indication to withdraw from the commitment, it will be until 2019 before it can formally withdraw. Even though it indicated it, there were two things that this administration had already had said that in effect undermined its commitment. The first it said is it was not going to implement the Clean Power Plan under the Clean Air Act of the US, which was going to be the main way in which it met its commitments. And on the financing side, under the new budget, it had blacklined the funding to the Green Climate Fund and to the climate investment funds. So it withdrew from the financing even before it made the announcement of the withdrawal from Paris. So that's the US position. Now, what does that imply as far as the rest of the world is concerned? So at the G7 meeting last month, the 6 countries, other than the US, indicated that they intended to remain firm in their commitment to Paris and to the implementation of Paris. Now, those of you who follow G7 agreements will know that it has never been the case where G6 countries have, in some sense, lined up against one country to make a statement. So this was actually a very, very unique moment where 6 countries said, no, Paris is actually very important, and we intend to stay firm with Paris. And that was very, very important. The second is that, the conversation about Paris has really changed very, very fundamentally from one about the costs of action to now what are the opportunities that come from strong climate action. And let me explain that, and particularly I want to explain it because three of us have been very closely involved in the new climate economy, Nana Kidwai here, who is a member of the commission, Rajat and myself. And a central message of the work of the new climate economy is that actually acting on moving towards a low carbon transition and taking strong climate action is good for growth and development rather than being thought of as a cost. And there is more and more evidence of it. Why is that the case? Essentially, that's the case because when you invest in low carbon infrastructure, you are making long-term savings that in some sense add up to a benefit. And on the other side, in investing in high carbon infrastructure mounts up to increasing costs over time. And that's the essential arithmetic of it. Second, investing in low carbon infrastructure gives you significant other kinds of benefits. Think about pollution. I mean, think about India and think about pollution. The costs of pollution now are increasing very highly, and if you value them, then you will say that actually investing in low carbon infrastructure is actually very, very timely. Think about connected, compact cities. They produce livable spaces. They produce benefits in terms of accessibility and mobility. So investing in mass transit as opposed to lots of roads makes sense, not because of the climate, but it makes sense for the people and for the quality of life. So this new understanding has also very much permeated Paris, that we have to think about these massive investments we need to make as an opportunity. In the next 15 to 20 years, we will invest more in infrastructure than exists on the planet today. More, and a lot of that will be here in India, for example. So if you think of investing that infrastructure in as good quality as it can be, it is a significant opportunity to leapfrog and to do things better, to build more livable cities, to have energy systems that actually provide better energy and cleaner energy, and to have connectivity with, for example, much more reliance on rail than on roads. So this should be thought of as an opportunity. It has financing implications, and I will come to that. So in this kind of a world, if the US steps out, what does it mean for the rest of the world? It basically means no change in course. We'll come back to if the US persists with this, but it should not be seen as any excuse by any of us for doing less. Instead, we should be doing more. So now I want to come to the financing side of it. So when you think about financing about climate, for a long time, the debate was about, in a sense, framed in climate justice. What do I mean by climate justice? Well, the carbon that has been put out there was put out by the advanced countries, and we cannot afford, in some sense, the cost. We don't have the ability, and therefore there needs to be compensation by rich countries to poor countries for the carbon. And a lot of the initial framing of finance was put in those terms. Increasingly, it has become now in terms of enabling the kinds of transitions that we were talking about. And there are three particular types of needs that have emerged as far as climate finance is concerned. The first is, we know that climate change is occurring, and is occurring at an increasingly rapid pace. And we also know that its impact is the most severe on the poor and vulnerable, and on poor and vulnerable countries, and that they need the assistance to be able to cope with that. So a very significant emphasis of climate finance is how to help poor and vulnerable countries adapt and cope with climate shocks. So that's one element. And indeed, half of the money on climate funding is supposed to go for that purpose under the UNFCCC framework. Second, there is a recognition that there are natural carbon sinks, especially forests, and those forests happen to be located in some countries, Brazil, Indonesia, and several parts of Asia as well as Latin America. And protecting those forests is a global public good. So the world at large should help with the financing of the preservation of forests and the restoration of natural landscapes. So that's a second motivation for climate finance. The third one is that we need finance to transform the growth path and the investment path to low carbon and to more resilient climate investments. But here we have to recognize that the investments we are talking about is not climate investments. They are the totality of investments in infrastructure that we want to make more climate sensitive and more climate proof. And the magnitudes of these investments are not in the billions of dollars, but they are in the trillions of dollars. Indeed, if you add up all the investments of infrastructure in the next 15 years, it adds up to a whopping $90 trillion. And almost 2/3 of that investments have to be made in emerging markets and developing countries. So obviously, this is a huge sum of money, and a big question is, where is that money going to come from? Now, when you build infrastructure not for this generation alone, you build it for the next and the next generation. So it's absolutely imperative to get finance to build that infrastructure. But if the cost of that finance is too high, then instead of being an enabler, it becomes a magnifier of cost. And that is a problem in many emerging markets and developing countries. If you look at the situation in India, for example, we know that the infrastructure financing needs are very large. But if you look at the fiscal situation, it's very difficult to generate fiscal savings to finance infrastructure, given the very large needs for current expenditures on health, education, poverty, and the like. So therefore, many people argue that the fisc cannot be relied on for financing of infrastructure. If you look at the banks are loaded up through bad lending on infrastructure. And so their position is quite limited. So as Rakesh Mohan pointed out, we do need to think about complementary sources. The analysis that he has done suggests that India could run around 3% of current account deficit to finance infrastructure, but where will that financing come from? And a very important part of that financing has to come from banks and international development banks. And that's why in the discussion that we had in the prior session, we emphasize very much the importance of strengthening the role of international and multilateral development banks to support and catalyze. The last point I want to make with regard to financing, actually like 2 points I want to make. One is the importance of national development banks in the space of infrastructure. In the case of Brazil or in the case of China, national development banks provide the vast amount of financing required for infrastructure. In the case of India, the national development banks play a very, very modest role. Private finance is critical, but you need to be able to have that catalytic role, and that catalytic role can only be played by development banks taking, in some sense, a public, honest broker position. And one issue, therefore, in the case of India and many other emerging markets and developing countries now is revisiting the issue of national development banks in the space of rapid transition to to a low carbon economy. Let me end a little bit pointing out a little bit, what does this all imply for the G20? So the first thing it implies for the G20 is, what will the G20 say in Hamburg that is in some sense now going to be cognizant of the Trump administration's views? Much of what has to be said in the G20 has already been set up through the work of this year. In the energy and climate sphere, there is an energy and climate working group that has come up with an action plan that in some sense commits, that in a strong way commits to the Marrakesh action plan and to Paris, and that sets forth all the areas where actions need to be taken. Now, the question is, will the G20 back away from those positions because of the US withdrawal from the Paris Accord? And it's extremely important that Germany, through its leadership, and all other countries, including India, stay firm with the position that no, we intend to continue to pursue the actions that are central in terms of delivering on the ambitions of the Paris Agreement and on the 2030 development agenda. Another area where the G20 has been very active has been the green finance agenda. Here, there is a little bit of a misunderstanding, I would say, of the green finance agenda in India. It's seen as too much of a regulatory agenda, but actually it is about disclosure of climate risk, and it is about a positive agenda of building up green finance in support of this transition. And again, I think it's extremely important that the G20 say we will remain firm with the work of the Green Finance Study Group and with the recommendations of the Task Force on Financial Disclosures of Climate Risk, and they should stay very firm. The third area that the G20 can provide leadership on is the role of the multilateral development banks. Just today, a group that was launched by the G20 to look at the role of it's called an Eminent Persons Group on Global Governance. It was just launched at Baden-Baden by the G20 finance ministers. They are having their first meeting in London, and it's extremely important that that group, which some of us think of what Dr. Reddy had called a mini Bretton Woods, as at least a move in that direction, stay very firm in revamping the multilateral development banks and the IMF and reforming its governance. So that could be another track that we need to remain firm on and make that a clear issue. It is not clear when India will take the chairmanship of the G20. It looks increasingly unlikely that it will be in 2019. But whenever it does, it's extremely important that this agenda India own and India take forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that very lucid presentation. I would like to add on my little two bits onto some points you made. One is about the low carbon growth pathway being good for growth and development. And in fact, in India, a report that has been prepared in India shows that it is also good for inclusive growth. There's no contradiction between the two. And secondly, about climate justice, the concept itself has been relegated to a preamble, a reference, saying that it is important for some in the Paris Agreement. And I think historical responsibility has itself somehow become a historical sort of concept in the new situation that we have before us. You were mentioning about USA and at the G20. I think we're heading to a G19+1 situation where you would have, and there's no contradiction between, when you look at consensus and unanimity, unanimity -1 is still a consensus, and that is how it is often looked at in these sort of negotiations. So let's see where that ends up. With those few comments, I will now give the floor to Dr. Naoyuki Yoshino, who is Dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute. He's also Professor Emeritus of Keio University in Tokyo, Chief Advisor at the Japan Financial Service Agency's Financial Research Center. He has a PhD from Johns Hopkins, visiting scholar at universities in Australia and France. He's been chair of the Financial Planning Standards Board in 2007, and in 2013 he received the very important Fukuzawa Award for his contribution to academic research. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me. My presentation is mainly focusing on green finance and finance for environment. In the morning session and the early afternoon session, India is dominated by banking industries. For renewable energy and energy projects, we require long-term financing. And on the second, you can see long-term financing mainly comes from pension funds and insurance. And so in order to develop this green finance, India also has to develop long-term financing. And if we are facing with aging population, pension funds has to be accumulated. And individually, we have to join insurance products. So I think those two are very important to finance long-term. Bank loans are usually 2 years up to 5 years. And that is not enough to finance long-term projects. And second financing in the bottom on the right-hand side is green bond. And I would like to explain later on. There are two kinds of bonds. One is fixed interest rate, and another one is floating interest rate bonds. So that I would like to talk about in what cases, what kind of project and bonds will be necessary. And third one is on the left-hand side bottom. I'm going to talk about crowdfunding, which is called Hometown Investment Trust Funds. And Japan has created about 15 years ago, and now Cambodia, Vietnam, and Peru, and Mongolia are following. So I would like to talk about those crowdfunding for our infrastructure and also energy projects. First, I would like to talk about how to increase rate of return from green finance. The biggest problem for infrastructure is rate of returns are always low. However, good infrastructure creates spillover effects. And green power can produce electricity into the region. And then the land price, property price in that region will increase. And companies come to the region to produce their products, and employment will be created. So good green energy infrastructure can create spillover effects along those regions. The tax revenues in the region will increase. However, in the past, all those tax revenues went to the government, and infrastructure investors could not receive any return. They only relied on user charges. And electric power is a public goods, so prices are often regulated by the government. That is why private investors could not come into the market. And then there's a method called difference in different. We can compare the spillover effects along this power plant, and then the region where very far away from those new power. Then we can see the incremental contribution of tax revenues, which are supplied by electricity. And that portion on the blue line is, has a steeper slope, and that is the gain from tax revenue coming from new green power energy. And suppose 50% of those powers can be returned to the investors. In this diagram, private investors used to receive just user charges, and that was very low. But tax revenue will go up every year, property tax, income tax, and corporate tax. And then, for example, 50% of those tax revenue would be returned to the infrastructure investors, then the rate of return continues to increase. So this is a way to bring private sector money, and also a national development bank can receive enough rate of return. Then the National Development Bank can find out next project because the rate of return becomes much higher. And related infrastructure, green infrastructure, hydropower, and so on. Many people think about hydropower as a big project, and it has to be a big dam. But recently, new technology can bring us community-type hydropower. Very small river that can produce the village power for the electricity because the efficiency of the power became much, much larger. So in Japan, in rural regions, we have started to experiment small plant to many, many places rather than constructing big hydropower. And those small finance comes from village fund. People in the region will contribute some money. And then later on, the property price will go up, and new company can be produced, and each farmers can produce much more efficiently, and that will increase tax revenue. And then 50% of the tax revenue, those investors can receive it. So there are two types of green finance. One is community type, and another type is large infrastructure. And large infrastructure can be financed by insurance and pension funds. And small community power plant can be financed by hometown investment trust funds, which I'll explain a little bit more. This is one of the examples of wind power. And investors on the left-hand side, about 2,000 people put some money to this wind power. And that was constructing the power. And in Japan, if people use this green power, we have to pay 5% extra money compared to other electricity. So that will become a sufficient return for those green finance. The reason why we have to pay 5% charge is this is very much better for our environment and so on. And furthermore, our government is saying you should reduce 5% of your electricity turning off your light much more quickly so that you can just spend the same amount of money, but by paying 5% extra for two renewable energies. Another way is now Japan has started gradually, the bottom of the red portion, carbon tax and NOx tax. Government is started to collect. And those tax can be put in to this green power fund. That will also secure the rate of return for private investors. And all these power are financed by individuals in the region. And the structure is, as I said, 5% extra price is charged to the individuals. And recently, tax on carbon and NOx are now being to be transferred to the extra revenue for those. And village hometown funds are often used for solar power. One city in Japanese prefecture, Nagano, 200 households started to put their solar power onto the roof. And all these money comes from, again, the hometown investment trust funds. And hometown investment trust funds, the method is the following. Wind power project, solar power project. It is advertised through internet. Mainly in the individuals in the village, region, contributed. But some of the person who had staying in Tokyo or big city, and they want to encourage wind powers, also contribute those money to the green energy. And small amount of money, but that can create a very large projects of 200, 300 individuals, solar power and wind power. And some funds are 8 years, and some funds are much longer. But for individuals, 8 years to 10 years are the most popular fund. And these are the expected rate of return from those funds. And solar power, this is a map of Japan, had been constructed by this method in many places in Japan, because most of the money comes from individuals, especially after Fukushima nuclear plant accident. Many people started to realize we have to rely on green energy. So that accident was very tough accident, but it became a very good incentive for individuals to help this green energy. And another scheme is 377 solar power plants has been constructed, very similar method. And this is a revitalization of old hydropower. It was constructed more than 100 years ago. and it was abolished, and it was not used for many years. But after the Fukushima nuclear accident, many people realized we should rebuild those hydropower. And that was also created very small village and then created a supply of powers. Last point is green bond and revenue bond. These green bond, revenue bond will be suitable for institutional investors. So the big projects, large green projects. And probably we could issue various kinds of maturities, 10 year, 15 year, 20 years. But investors are required to invest these green bond, revenue bond. So insurance and pension funds has to be created, and it has to become bigger. And furthermore, they can receive stable amount of revenue by putting spillover effects into the rate of return. The last question is, where should it be principal guaranteed or revenue bond? I prefer the revenue bond rather than fixed price bond. If the price were fixed, then government often has to support losses viability gap in order to bring up to the rate of return. So I don't think a fixed rate of return guarantee will necessarily be good. And rather, it is better to have floating bond. But 50% of spillover tax revenue could be returned to the investors. That will create a very strong incentive, and continuously those tax revenue can be collected, and the investors can receive very stable amount of money. And because of these efforts, Japan's solar power has been enormously increasing in these 2 years. I think that can reduce lots of females' jobs and so on. So that's all my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I thank Professor Yoshino for again, very nicely presented statement on long-term financing. You have correctly pointed out pension funds and their role in long-term financing, green bonds, fixed and floating, crowdfunding. And I must say, this is something relatively new for India. We've not got involved with it as yet. But as you said, hometown investment trust funds may be a little difficult in a financial resource constrained country, and especially in rural areas. But it's something to be open-minded about, and we'll see. Maybe Indians abroad might want to do some funding into their villages, which they left a long time ago. Who knows? So it's good to be open-minded on these things. With that, I will now give the floor to Nainalal Kidwai, our next speaker. She is chair of FICCI Sustainability, Energy and Water Council and chairman of Max Financial Services and Advent Private Equity. She's also a director of Nestle, Cipla, L&T, and a past president of FICCI. Till December 2015, she was on the board of HSBC Asia Pacific and chairman of HSBC India. She's a recipient of numerous honors for her contribution to trade and industry. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you. I opted to go last, but not maybe fully recognizing the risk of having a lot that I might have said being said. So I shall pick bits and pieces of what may not have been said or shade it with some of my thoughts on the subject. So Amar mentioned that Rajat and I are part of something called the Global Commission. And I just thought I would reiterate that the scale of infrastructure, the $90 trillion globally that is required for infrastructure is a pretty frightening number. And then that estimate of the NCE, where $4 trillion of that comes into what is the global south, so emerging markets, and really, if you begin to drill down to India, it tells you what the scale of financing is that will be required to get our infrastructure up and running. Now, the other side of looking at this is the opportunity, really, is that it isn't going to cost a lot more to put that infrastructure in a green way than if it were in the old way. So it really begs the question of, well, why wouldn't we try and get it right as we go ahead and do it? And I think in trying to get it right, the role of finance becomes critical, because without finance, projects don't happen. So finance can ensure that the projects that come up encompass these principles of what is right infrastructure. And right infrastructure is not just renewable energy. I think Amar rightly mentioned it is about the right urban infrastructure. It is about looking at green ways of, whether it's electricity, whether it is railways, or indeed looking at suburban rail systems, and the way we plan our cities to make sure that our cities are compact, connected, and minimizing the need for people to transport themselves across huge distances, just disgorging carbon into the air and the pollution that has become a way of life for many of us countries like China and India because of the growth trajectory and the urbanization trajectory we're on. So in looking at finance, there is a formidable issue in terms of scale, but the opportunity of ensuring that finance guides the growth that our country embarks on, and that many developing countries who are going to put this infrastructure in are going to embark on, happens in the right way. And the old discussion around, the cost having been borne largely by the world in terms of the way the developed country developed, must now support what countries like ours need, certainly holds, but it can't be the reason for us not to do what we need to do in any case. To the extent that this financing is available, and it should certainly be a responsibility of the rest of the world to help us close the gap in a way that works for us. And it must work not just in terms of quantum, but also the rate of interest. And that rate of interest comes down if we can de-risk projects. And you can de-risk projects with guarantees. So I came in towards the tail end of the last panel and the role of multilaterals, etc. So the role that we are in fact pushing some of the newer institutions, the AIIBs and the NDBs to, the role which ADB and indeed IFC have played in the past, which have been critical for us, is credit enhancement. What credit enhancement does is it allows the project to close, it allows the project to de-risk itself in a way that interest rates become more manageable, so that the infrastructure cost for people who are to use the infrastructure, or for example, in renewable energy to make sure it is competitive with fossil fuel energy, become far more manageable. So the credit enhancement spaces, both by local groups and I think Amar appealing back into the sort of NDB structure, but at least some structure becomes important to take this forward. I'd also just highlight that another way of looking at financing is the whole area of fossil fuel subsidies. And if you look at the momentum that is building up, and it's been growing for a while in terms of correcting for fossil fuel subsidies and to make sure that that reform and carbon pricing comes in, that we've actually seen that in the last 3 years, almost 30 countries have initiated or accelerated reforms of fossil fuel subsidies, including India. In fact, in March 2016, India doubled the tax on coal, lignite, and peat, and uses the proceeds to fund clean energy. So pretty progressive in terms of the way we are addressing this issue. And the number of carbon pricing initiatives implemented or scheduled have almost doubled over the past 5 years. So for example, in 2017, China is implementing a national emission trading system, and South Africa is introducing a carbon tax. So, in fact, in total, there are 40 countries and 25 cities, states, and regions who've implemented or scheduled carbon pricing as per a World Bank report. So we are moving into a zone where some of these aspects are being addressed in a meaningful way. And in fact, 90 countries refer to some form of carbon pricing in their Paris Agreement pledges. So these are the initiatives which become so critical for the Paris Agreement to move forward and for us to stay the track. And the good news is that the momentum is there, and I do believe that countries that have signed on will stay the track because we believe in what is required therein. Now, as we go forward, we begin to see what that infrastructure is in countries like ours. So I'm going to now move into what we have in India, what we need to do in India, because India is going to be such an important part of getting this right for the rest of the world, and clearly for getting it right for ourselves. Mention was made of green bonds. We've had our first entries into this. The issue with our green bond market, and there's a lot of work going on the subject. There are a number of initiatives that are happening in the green bond space, is raising green bonds or having green bonds available as in financing for projects is actually easier than the other side of it, which is to ensure that we have projects which can receive the money. So yes, renewable energy stands out, it gets it. But there are many projects which, for example, if you look at the whole idea that metros are green because they replace other forms of travel and carbon emission, then how you get a green bond financing into that project becomes key. And what we lack is both the skill and the availability of talent that can actually certify and ensure that the definitions of green are wide enough but strong enough to receive the money. And addressing our projects from this standpoint with a view to getting the financing done and the dots connected is going to be key, even as we push to get more green bonds out there. A second area which has been missing in our country is municipal bonds. A big area which we need the ability for our municipalities to raise money. The challenge, of course, is the state of the municipalities. But the good news is not every municipality is down the drain, so to speak. And so we can actually select, pick, and create bodies which can raise the money for specific projects. And this is going to need crafting. Again, a skill set that does not exist. It doesn't certainly exist in the municipality. It barely exists in the country in terms of how we can structure these deals to direct money in the right way in there. Now, I'd certainly like to point you to a very important initiative, and these are the sort of examples that I'd certainly like to see a lot more of, and I want to congratulate ICRIER for the work you are doing in the scaling up rooftop solar in India and the potential of municipal solar bonds. So I understand that you've actually got an event planned shortly in June on this. But why is this project important? This project becomes important because you heard mention earlier, rooftop solar is very exciting. Distributed energy is very exciting for India. It begins to close the gaps where large-scale projects, for all the problems we're discussing, are just not going to get done, maybe not in the time scale we want. So here we have rooftop solar as an important initiative. And the interesting space here is if the target of 40 gigawatts by 2022 and the growth of rooftop solar system needs to be accelerated further, the current capacity is only 1.2 gigawatts, despite the government push. And this is also because, given that it's a distributed power generation model for rapid growth, the rooftop solar mission should really attract a large number of small generators and therefore manage to keep the costs low. And as we look at distributed energy across the board, the availability of debt becomes an issue because it restricts the growth of the sector. And therefore, what the study suggests is the increased role of municipal governments to address these issues. And how can municipal bonds be used as a tool to this end? And I understand that looking at this, the study will look at two separate urban contexts in India, so Surat and NDMC, and see how the financial concerns of the sector, and specifically for rooftop solar, can be tackled. So these are very exciting initiatives, a study that demonstrates the challenges, I'm sure, but also the fact that it is a possibility, becomes a very critical way for us to begin to address some of these issues. Then as we go ahead, the whole area again of yield cos and green IPOs, I don't want to get into too much of the technology of this, except to say that sometimes there are assets which will qualify to be in a category of green, and it's a case of bundling these into discrete SPVs, which can then be financed. So the model would typically be that banks step in, do the near-term financing, because that is the model India has done, pretty much the model that the only model India knows. But we need to provide mechanisms for takeout financing. So once the project has actually closed, is up and running, a way to get it off the bank into the capital markets so that it opens up again the ability of the banks to go in and finance something else. And the weakness in markets such as India have been the capital markets end of it. So banks have been relied on too long and for too much of the financing, and typically banks give a 5-year sort of tenor, and these are projects that would require at least 15 years. So that mismatch is not good. And by developing our capital markets through the entry of insurance and pension funds, as was also mentioned, we allow this ability, the ability to move the funding off banks into the capital markets and into longer tenured financing as well. And then, of course, the National Clean Energy Fund and these sort of institutions become important because they provide the last gaps in the financing or the credit enhancement, which helps. One of the areas which, again, India has been quite slow to embark on is the area of what banks will finance or not. Globally, many banks came together for projects under the Equator Principles, which established which projects we would fund and which we would not fund, given certain parameters of were they meeting sustainability criteria. And these criteria were not overly strict, but were certainly higher than anything that we had in country. So to begin to now look at this stage of our growth at an Indian norm, which we as Indian banks and the country are comfortable with, so that it's not a case of, hey, I won't fund this project because I believe it is devastating for the environment, that it will destroy forests, and its technologies are old or inefficient, and somebody else in the system is happy to do it. So that code is under development. It's been something which some of us work quite hard to get off the ground, and it has been a struggle because there is no point having a norm which some banks follow and others don't. It has to be a code, and I think more work on this becomes important. And it should be a code that India is comfortable with and that supports our agenda, not one that's imported, but one that we then all subscribe to. And I would just, moving away from the specifics of finance, also just touch on the fact that we have to look at the framework of financing through the lens of sustainability, which means rating systems, audit systems, sustainability reports that corporates must be forced to bring out and share what they're doing in the space, just begins to create a discipline around what is happening and what needs to be done. And initially, it can be really just about disclosure, but I do hope in time there's much more of a stick and possibly carrot system to it as well. One of the big challenges is how do we tackle the issues around the SMEs? SMEs which employ large numbers of people, SMEs being the small companies for whom the financing cost to get to the point which we would call a sustainable project, or one where banks would be happy to lend in my sort of framework, then